Welcome. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how we can show the widget on clients and how this is going to involve replicating variables. Now, we're going to want to know when a variable has been replicated. So we're going to learn how we can make a function that will be called on clients when the variable has been replicated. And this type of function is known as a rep notify. So let's get started. So I'm back in blasterCharacter.h, and I'd like to have a variable that can store the weapon that we're currently overlapping. So let's make a new private variable. I'm going to forward declare the class aWeapon, and this variable will be called overlapping weapon. Now we want this variable to be replicated, which means when it changes on the server, then we'd like it to change on all clients. And we can replicate a pointer to an aWeapon. To do this, we need to add a uProperty and add the replicated uProperty specifier. This will designate overlapping weapon to be a replicated variable. Now, this isn't the only thing we need to do to replicate a variable. We have to override a function. That's going to be a public function, so we're going to override it right here in the public section. Now, the function we need to override in any class where we plan on replicating variables is a virtual void function, and it's called getLifetimeReplicatedProps. Now, this function takes a T array of f lifetime properties. And this T array is passed in by reference, and it's called out lifetime props. Now, this function is a const function, and we're overriding it. And inside this function is where we register variables to be replicated. So let's make a function definition for getLifetimeReplicatedProps. Now, I'd like to move this function definition up near the top, just under the constructor. And since we're overriding this function, we need to call super getLifetimeReplicatedProps. So we'll call the super version and pass in that input parameter out lifetime props. And here is where we need to register our overlapping weapon variable to be replicated. Now, to do that, we use the macro called doRepLifetime. And in doRepLifetime, we specify the aBlasterCharacter class. That's the class that has the replicated variable. And we also specify the replicated variable, which will be overlapping weapon. Now notice we get the red squiggles because doRepLifetime is undefined. And that macro is defined in a header that we need to include whenever we replicate variables. That header that we're going to include is net/UnrealNetwork.h. Once we include that header, now doRepLifetime will be defined. So this variable starts off uninitialized. It'll be null until we set it. Now we'd like to set it from the weapon class in our overlap function on sphere overlap, which means I'm going to need a public setter for this variable. So I'll stick one down here at the bottom of Blaster character. Now I'd like it to be inline, so I'm going to use a force inline macro, and this will be void, and I'll call this set overlapping weapon. And it'll take an aWeapon pointer. I'll simply call this weapon, and we'll just set overlapping weapon equal to weapon. So we can set this variable. And as soon as the value of overlapping weapon changes, then it will replicate, which means the variable will be set on all client Blaster characters. Now, replication works only when the variable is changed. So it's not going to replicate every frame or every net update, for example. Only when overlapping weapon actually changes on the server does it change on the clients. So we can set this in weapon.cpp in onSphere overlap. So let's set it here in onSphere overlap for the weapon. We're going to get Blaster character, which we have access to here since we cast other actor to a Blaster character. And here in onSphere overlap, we're going to call set overlapping weapon, passing in this. So the weapon will call this function, and in our blaster character class, overlapping weapon will be set. So this means we no longer need to check to see if pickup widget is valid here. So all we're doing is setting overlapping weapon on blaster character. On blaster character, we need to know when we should show that widget. I'd like to create a convenient function here on the weapon class for showing that widget. So here in weapon.h, I'm going to add a public section up here just under tick. This will be void, and I'll call this show pickup widget. Now I can give a Boolean input parameter called bShowWidget. And that way we can pass in true or false whether we want to show or hide the pickup widget. So let's define show pickup widget. And we can show the widget down here. Now I'd like to keep my weapon.cpp organized. So I'm going to move tick up here just under begin play. Now in show pickup widget, we simply need to get our pickup widget and set its visibility. So first we're going to check to make sure pickup widget is valid. And if it is, we'll get pickup widget and call set visibility, passing in bShowWidget. So when we call this function, the bool we pass in will determine whether we show or hide pickup widget. Now the question is, when do we call this function? Now we only know in blaster character whether or not overlapping weapon is null. And we can use that information to show or hide the widget. Now it'd be great if we had a function that could be called when this overlapping weapon variable gets replicated, but we haven't learned that yet. So we can take a naive approach, which won't be very optimal, but it'll work for now until we learn a better solution. So let's go to our tick function. And again, I'd like to keep these organized in blasterCharacter.cpp. So I'm going to move the tick function up here towards the top, just under begin play. And here in tick, I'm simply going to check to see if overlapping weapon is valid. And if it is, we know that we can show the pickup widget on that overlapping weapon. So I'm going to say if overlapping weapon, if that's valid, I'm going to take overlapping weapon and call its show pickup widget function and pass in true. Now we're using overlapping weapon here, which means we need to include its header file. So at the top of blaster character, I'm going to add an include, and weapon is in the weapon class, which means we need to add the include blaster/weapon/weapon.h. And now that we're including weapon.h, that variable type is defined. So here in tick, as soon as overlapping weapon becomes set on the server, then on all clients, we'll be showing that pickup widget. And we'll be setting this Boolean to true every frame, which again is not very optimal, but we'll learn a better way very shortly. Let's go ahead and compile this. Now back here in the editor, let's go ahead and play test this and see how this works. I'm going to first gain control of one of my clients, and now I see that the pickup widget is set here on the client. In fact, it's set on all the clients. And that's because here in the tick function, overlapping weapon is replicated to all clients. That's how replication works. When we mark this variable to be replicated, as soon as its value changes on the server, it will then be set on the version of blaster character on all clients. Now we registered this variable to be replicated here in get lifetime replicated props. And it really only makes sense to show the widget on the client who owns this character. We don't need to set overlapping weapon on the simulated proxies on client machines. In other words, when someone else overlaps with a weapon, we don't need to see the pickup widget on our machine above that weapon. Well, we can control which clients have this variable replicated to them. We can do this by adding a condition when we register this variable to be replicated. To use a replicating condition, we use a different macro. We use doRepLifetime condition. And in addition to specifying the class and the variable, we also specify a condition. Now there are enum constants that we can use to specify conditions. Notice we have conditions autonomous only, which will only replicate this to autonomous proxies. We also have several others, including owner only. Now, we're going to talk more about the concept of ownership, but think of it as whoever's controlling the pawn. If you are controlling the pawn on your machine, you're the owner of that pawn. So if we specify owner only as the condition, then overlapping weapon will only replicate to the client that owns the blaster character. So let's compile this and see the behavior here. So I'm going to hit play and walk up to the weapon on one of the clients. Now notice there's a difference here. We do see it on the server, but we only see this pickup widget on the client that overlapped with the weapon. On the other client here, we don't see it. And that's because the variable did not replicate to this client. It only replicated to the client that owns the pawn that overlapped with the weapon's area sphere. Now notice here in weapons on sphere overlap that we're setting the overlapping weapon, and this only happens on the server. So as soon as we call set overlapping weapon, then here in blaster character, we've set the overlapping weapon on the server. And since we're setting it on the server, we're replicating it to the owning client, as we're specifying in getLifetimeReplicated props only to replicate it to the owner. Now we don't need to see the pickup widget on the server unless the server is controlling the pawn that's overlapping. In other words, it owns that pawn. So this method of showing the pickup widget in the tick function isn't going to work. So what we can do instead of setting the visibility of the pickup widget in the tick function, I'm going to remove that, is we can set up a function that will be called whenever the variable's value gets replicated. This type of function is called a rep notify. Here's how we set it up. Here in blasterCharacter.h, we can create a function that will be our rep notify. These are void functions, and the convention is to use onRep underscore followed by the name of the variable that's being replicated. So this is going to be overlapping weapon. Now, we can't pass any meaningful values in to a rep notify, as these are called automatically when the variable gets replicated. Now, these also need to be U functions, so we have to have a U function macro in order to use this. Now, in order to designate this rep notify to be called whenever overlapping weapon gets replicated, we take our overlapping weapon U property and we add the specifier replicated using, and then we specify the rep notify. So it's going to be onRep overlapping weapon. Now with this U property specifier, we will now have onRep overlapping weapon be called on the client when overlapping weapon replicates to that client. So let's make a definition for this rep notify. So here's our rep notify, and in the rep notify, we know that overlapping weapon has changed as it has just been replicated. So we can show the pickup widget in here. Now we first need to check to see if overlapping weapon is not null, because it could be null. If overlapping weapon is set to null from the server when it wasn't null before, then that change will replicate down to the client. So if overlapping weapon is valid, we can take overlapping weapon and call show pickup widget and pass in true. So let's compile this and see how this works. So I'm going to hit play. And now I'm going to overlap with my client, and notice something here. We only see the widget on the client that overlapped with the weapon. We don't see it on the server here. Now this is an important detail to take note of. We don't get the widget on the server because rep notifies do not get called on the server. They only get called when the variable replicates, and replication only works one way, from server to client. So since it'll never be replicated to the server will never get the rep notify called. So this introduces another issue. When we overlap with the weapon on the server here with the server-controlled character, we don't get the widget. And that's because we're only showing that widget in a rep notify. So we need to handle the case when we are the server. So let's handle this in our function where we're setting the overlapping weapon. Now, rather than having a simple getter, I'm going to remove the force inline now and add more logic to this setter. So I'm not going to have the definition all in one line like this. I'm going to define a set overlapping weapon in blasterCharacter.cpp. So I'm going to set it right here, just above the rep notify. Now in this setter, the first thing I'm going to do is set overlapping weapon. So we're going to set it equal to weapon. And then we need to make sure that we only show the widget on the character that's actually controlling the pawn. Now we know that this is only called on the server because we're calling it from the weapon's on-sphere overlap, which only gets called on the server. But now we need to know if we're actually on the character that's controlling the pawn. Now we can check with a very handy function, which returns a Boolean, called isLocallyControlled. Now isLocallyControlled will be true if this function is called on the character that's actually being controlled. So again, we know we're on the server, so if we reach the inside of this if check, we know that we're on the character being controlled by the player who is hosting the game on the server. Now if that's the case, we know that overlapping weapon will not be replicated because we have our condition up here, owner only. And none of the clients will be owners of this character because it's locally controlled on the server. So in this case, all we need to do is show the pickup widget. So I'm going to take this logic here and paste it into our if statement here. Now we know that we'll see the widget on the server when the server controlled character overlaps with it. So let's compile this. And in the editor, we can test this out. So I'm going to take my server controlled character here and overlap, and now we see that we have the pickup widget. Now, if I get my two clients back here, I see that we do not see the widget on the clients. This is exactly what I wanted because I only want to see that pickup widget on the machine for the player who is controlling the character. Now, on the client, if we overlap, then we see the pickup widget. And we can test the case where only the client overlaps and the server does not. So if I overlap with a client, we don't see it on the server. So we're getting closer. Now we still aren't hiding the widget. If I stop overlapping, the widget is still there. That means we need an end overlap function. So let's add that. We can do that here in weapon.h. So in addition to on-sphere overlap, we want an on-sphere end overlap. So let's make that. It's going to be void on-sphere end overlap. And for this type of callback for an on-component end overlap delegate, we need a U primitive component called overlapped component, an A actor called other actor, a primitive component called other comp, and an int32 other body index. So I'm going to add those input parameters here. And this also has to have the U function macro. So I'm going to add that. And I can define this function. So here in weapon.cpp, I'm going to do the same thing I did in onSphere overlap, namely take other actor and cast to a blaster character, and if that blaster character is valid, call set overlapping weapon, only since we're ending overlap, we don't need to set it to this, but rather we're setting it to null. So I'm going to use null pointer here. So now if we end overlap, overlapping weapon on the character will be null. So now we need to know how we can hide that widget because we're setting it to null. So it's not like we can access a null pointer to call show pickup widget. Well, let's go back to blaster character and look at our onRep overlapping weapon. This is our rep notify. Now I mentioned that we can't pass any input parameters in because we're not actively calling onRep overlapping weapon. It gets called automatically when the variable is replicated, right? So how can we access overlapping weapon after we've already set it to null? Now again, a naive approach would be to create another variable of a weapon pointer type called last overlapping weapon or something like that. And we could store a pointer to the overlapping weapon before we changed it. But there's an easier way. You see, rep notifies can have input parameters, but it can only have an input parameter of the type of the variable being replicated. In other words, onRep overlapping weapon can only have an A weapon pointer. Now we're going to call this last weapon. And that's because when you add an input parameter to a rep notify, then what gets passed in when it gets called upon variable replication? Well, it's going to be the last value before the replication happened. So in other words, let's say overlapping weapon starts off null, which is the case, right? Well, as soon as it changes on the server, then the new value replicates down to clients. And if we have this A weapon input parameter here, then the value inside this function for last weapon will be the last value of overlapping weapon before the variable was replicated. So that could be null, or it could simply be the last weapon we were overlapping before it was set. So if overlapping weapon changes, we should check its last value before the change, which we'll have access to here with last weapon. And if that value is not null, then we can access that last weapon and hide the pickup widget. So we'll do that down here. We'll say if last weapon, and if last weapon is not null, then we can take last weapon and call show pickup widget and pass in false. So this way, if we end overlap, then overlapping weapon will be set to null, which means this if check will fail, of course, but our last value for overlapping weapon will still have the pointer to that weapon that we just stopped overlapping. And in that case, we can hide the pickup widget. Now, before we compile this and test it out, we created this callback onSphere end overlap. We need to bind this to the onComponent end overlap delegate for the area sphere. So here in weapon.cpp, we can do this here in begin play with our check has authority. So we only want this happening on the server. So we're going to take area sphere and use onComponent end overlap and add dynamic. And we'll use this along with a weapon on sphere end overlap. And now we know that when we stop overlapping with a weapon, on sphere end overlap will be called. So let's compile this. And I'm going to test this out by taking one of my clients and I'll overlap. There's that pickup widget. And now I'll end overlap and the pickup widget goes away. So because that value last weapon is not null, even though overlapping weapon is set to null, since we have that last value, we're accessing it to hide the widget. So this will work for both clients. Here's my other client, and I see that it's working here. But when I take my server and I end overlap, it doesn't work. And that's because, again, we're setting this only in the rep notify, and the rep notify will not be called on the server. So we need to take care of the case when we are the server. Now we can do this here in Blaster character in our setter for set overlapping weapon. Here's where we're actually setting the value of overlapping weapon. So before we set this value, we can check to see if overlapping weapon is valid, and we can hide the pickup widget before we change it. So if we take these lines here where we check if overlapping weapon is valid and then call show pickup widget, we can pass in false here. So let's compile this and we can play test this. And on the server, I get the pickup widget, and on end overlap, we hide the widget. And this still works with clients. There's that client, and here's my other client. So we're now showing the pickup widget and hiding it at the appropriate time, and we're showing it for the correct player. Now that's okay that we're not checking if we're locally controlled here in set overlapping weapon, because if you think about it, this will only be called in the server, as it's called in that overlap function. And if we're on the server and overlapping with something, then we don't really need to show the pickup widget on the server for any other characters, as only the locally controlled character overlapping should see the widget anyway. So we now have the behavior that we want. So in this lecture, we learned about variable replication, and we're replicating a pointer to an A weapon called overlapping weapon. And we saw that replication only works one way, from server to client. And we learned about rep notifies, which are functions that get called when a variable gets replicated. And we saw that the rep notify only gets called on clients, as variables never get replicated to the server, only from the server. And we learned how we can use a condition to allow us to only replicate to the owner of a character. So rather than replicating a variable's value to all clients, we only replicate to the client that's currently controlling the pawn, in our case, blaster character. Great job! We'll continue in the next lecture.